Hi everyone, welcome to Lecture 17. Today we're going to talk about gangs and crime. So before we kind of get into lecture, I want you to just think for a second about how you know whether or not a group of people is what you would call a gang. In other words, when is a group of kids, a group of young adults, adolescents, actually something that you would call a gang, and why is it necessary to kind of make that distinction? Um, so we've got several terms that kind of get thrown around in the literature when you're talking about gangs and gang violence. Some people describe these groups as street gangs. Sometimes they get described as youth gangs, criminal street gangs. For the most part, when people are talking about being concerned about a gang problem, they're describing groups who have a public or a street social presence and who have a reputation for committing criminal activities. So, for the most part, what we're talking about, at least today, when we're talking about the characterization of a gang, we're talking about groups that primarily act and live and do most of their business on the streets. It is a street socialization type of culture. And when we're talking about the crimes that they're committing, for the most part, we're talking about predominantly street crimes, kind of part one offenses. So today, this is who we're primarily going to be talking about. Groups who would be committing what you would consider kind of either street types of crimes or your index crimes, drug crimes, violent crimes, property crimes, things to that nature. And what I want you to think about before we get going is, how would you determine, you yourselves determine, if a group of people is a gang? Is it maybe clothes that they would wear? Certain colors sometimes get associated with certain gangs. Certain types of tattoos that might signify people. Sometimes you might just know by who people are associating with. Um, we've got a lot of different characterizations. A lot of different people have their own idea about who should and should not be called a gang. Just to give you some kind of interesting quotes about this, thinking about what a gang actually is. I've got two quotations here. One is from an LA County Sheriff's Department gang expert a couple years ago who was asked, what is a gang? How do you know what a gang is? And he responded, I'll tell you what a gang is. It's a group of thugs. They're hoodlums, they're crooks, and criminals. The same reporter asked a member of an LA gang, what is a gang? And his response was a little bit tongue-in-cheek and probably meant to be kind of a joke, saying, we're a defensive club, man. So, there's a lot of different people who have a lot of different opinions about what a gang is and how you're going to define and characterize them. There's obviously a lot of people who have tried to do research in this, who have tried to understand how gangs develop, how they cultivate kind of an image and a persona, how they initiate new members. Anybody who's interested in studying kind of young adolescent crime, this is going to be a necessary part of your interest and of your study. So people who try to study gangs in the literature have tried to come up with kind of a definition that they're going to actually work with when they're going out and studying groups. And the accepted kind of criteria that they've come up with for what you have to have as a group to be called a gang, at least in the spirit of criminology research, includes four basic elements. First of all, they kind of decided that you have to have at least three people in your group to call it a gang. They kind of had to come up with a number, and they decided that any less than that really isn't describing the same type of group. But if you have at least three members, it's enough to say that you are some kind of a gang. They also decided that for the purposes of criminology research, when we're describing gangs, we're describing young people. People anywhere from about 12 to 24, at least when they, enter into gangs. Another way that gang researchers have decided we should determine whether or not groups are actually criminal gangs is whether or not that group views themselves as a gang, whether or not they are known by some kind of a name amongst themselves, whether or not that name is known by others. Almost all of the really famous, prolific gangs, they have a name. They have something that distinguishes them, that they recognize themselves as representing. Another element of gangs that come under study and have interest from criminology is the idea that gangs have some kind of permanence. In other words, you know, the kind of gangs that we're interested in studying aren't just three or four guys who go through high school together and then once they leave high school and go off and do other things, that's the end of the gang. So, gangs that we're interested in studying have some permanence. They have a degree of organization, they have higher up people who initiate younger people to continue the gang after they eventually have to leave it for whatever reason. And obviously, if you think about the three criteria that we just talked about, three or more members, 12 to 24, viewing themselves as a gang, known by others by a certain name. I mean, we could be describing a sports team at this stage, having some permanence, having organization. But what makes a gang in terms of studying criminology, is the fact that a lot of their activities involve some criminal activity. Not that everything they do is always committing crime, but one of the big signifiers of being a gang in terms of the crime and justice kind of spirit of study is the fact that they're committing crimes. So there are some other kind of common themes. Those are very broad kind of sweeping criteria, and a lot of different groups could kind of maybe get considered a gang by those standards. So there's some other themes that have been identified and highlighted in the research. One theme being that a lot of gangs tend to have a common ethnic or racial identity. There are very few kind of multiracial gangs out there, especially historically. That might be changing now, but for the most part, one thing that kind of has historically brought young men and young women together into gangs is that they share some kind of a common identity. And usually that's ethnicity or a racial type. And we know that another theme of gangs and gang activity is having a degree of territoriality. They have a certain amount of space within their community, within their neighborhood, that they've designated as their own, whether it's their own so that they can, you know, engage in drug activity in that area, whether it's just theirs for hanging out and having control of the streets. The point is, most gangs mark their territory in terms of graffiti and other types of identifying emblems. And think of that. Think of maintaining their territory as being a very important part of their activities. So we've talked about what a gang has to be, but what about what individual people have to be for you to call them a gang member? So in prior research, essentially, if you were, or let's say you were a researcher and you wanted to go out and do a study examining a gang. Well, how would you know who is in a gang and who isn't in a gang? Well, what prior researchers used to do is self-classification, which basically just means they would ask people whether or not they're in a gang. If they said yes, you would consider them being in the gang. The kind of old saying, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's probably a duck. So that was a pretty easy way to start gang research. And for the most part, this doesn't really end up being a very inaccurate way to do it. So there are some kind of interesting commonalities between prior and current gang members. One thing that researchers have found is that there are a lot of prior and current gang members who kind of, when you go through tests and you go through observations, seem to have a lot more antisocial attitudes and behaviors. In other words, think back to some of those subcultural theories that we've talked about so far in this class. What gang researchers have highlighted and acknowledged is the fact that there seems to be a culture amongst gangs, kind of encouraging and rewarding antisocial, criminal, deviant behavior over time. We also know that a lot of prior and current gang members have very extensive criminal records. These aren't usually people who, leaving adolescence don't have a rap sheet following them. Not always incredibly serious offenses, but a lot of these people have a lot of contact with the law. A lot of times local law enforcement will know who and who's not members of gangs, and occasionally will make a concerted effort to keep track of those people. And we also know that people who begin early adolescence by joining gangs, trying to become part of a gang, have an incredibly low degree of school completion. The amount of people who drop out of junior and high school to engage full time in activities with their gang is a very high number. Kind of an interesting finding that I don't know if not a lot of people necessarily think about in terms of whether or not someone is or is not in a gang is the idea that people might be affiliated with a gang without necessarily being full-time members. We actually know from neighborhood research that oftentimes a lot of kids who live in a neighborhood will say that they are affiliated with a certain gang, even though they've actually never done anything technically to be initiated, or they don't wear the same the way they don't wear the colors or engage in the criminal activity. But there's a lot of youths who describe themselves as being connected or affiliated with gangs without actually considering themselves members. Um, and usually what they do is they try to affiliate themselves to enjoy the protection of the gang, sometimes in exchange for small favors. And we also know that former full-time members of gangs really describe themselves as never truly stopping their gang affiliation, even if they just over time are participating in less and less of the activities. So even though the average person spends very little time actually engaged in a gang, a lot of them describe themselves as always being kind of affiliated with that group.